Welcome to another episode of Fuel for Thought with me, Jonny Boyle, Director of Brand Experience here at Fuel. In this series, I sit down with the makers, creators, and game changers shaping the brand and marketing world around us. Together, we're going to explore trends, innovations, and ideas while uncovering expert insights along the way. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Mark Little. From the RT newsroom to founding Storyful, and most recently as CEO and co-founder of Kinzen, we're going to look back at his remarkable career of innovation at the intersection of media and technology. As a pioneering journalist, media entrepreneur, tech leader, and accomplished author, Mark is a true trailblazer of the global media arena and a leading innovator in the field of online trust and safety. Join us as we dive into 3 decades of media disruption, discussing the shift from an attention economy to an intention economy, human agency in the age of superhuman technology, and what the future holds. Welcome, Mark. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Yeah, really looking forward to chatting today. And I think, full disclosure for everybody, we met a couple of weeks back.
Yeah.
You were speaking at the Innovators Festival that the Sunday Business Post put on down in the Google Foundry, which was an amazing event. Great to meet so many great minds. And what I'd love to do today is probably pick up on the conversation we didn't get to have that day, probably, because there was a number of things you said that day when you were talking that I think are really useful, probably, and have parallels to our world.
Yeah, and I mean, meeting you that day was amazing because I walked away with 10 different synapses firing at the same time. So to be back here to have this conversation is a gift.
It's great. Well, we'll try and get through a few of them today for sure. As I said, you got my attention. I think attention for us is massive in the marketing industry. It's been talked about for a long time, as far back as the late 70s with the computer scientist Herbert Simon talking about this idea that there's a wealth of information leads to this real deficit of attention. But everybody needs their attention. And how to get it is a real conversation at the moment. Marketing's also good. For a good friend of mine, and shout out to maybe Viv Chambers for saying this, said marketing's keen on things are dying all the time. The attention economy is dead. What's next? It's always looking for the next thing. You mentioned that day the attention economy is maybe moving to an intention economy.
Yeah.
I'd love to chat a little bit more about that because it made an impression on me. I'm not sure if I took the right meaning out of it, but I'd love to chat a little bit more about that as our start.
Yeah, and I'm glad you sort of said in the history of like marketing and PR, because if you go way back in Edward Bernays to the early part of like the 20th century, thinking about how propaganda and PR are very similar, because what you're trying to do is manage the supply of scarce facts and get them to the right audience and make them feel almost like without being manipulated. And I was always impressed by, the thinking that went into that, even though it's quite sinister if you think about it. And I think the key moment for me is 2001. That is the first year that the amount of information produced in the world exceeds the previous 70,000 years of human civilization.
Phenomenal.
So more content, information, data is produced that 1 year than any time in human history. And at that point, we get overwhelmed. And I think that's the moment when we go from this information age, which starts to develop, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, to an attention age, where the future belongs not to the people with the scarce facts or the information that you really need, but the people who can grab your attention, who can find some way to punch through the noise and grab you for that moment. And of course, the big platforms are built on that principle. They have to get the advertising to people that are overwhelmed. So what do? They develop algorithms that, out of sight of all of us, grab our attention for that moment to put something in front of us, and it tends to be an outrageous or emotional piece of content. And so we had this hidden editor in the background. And I talk to my kids about this, and they're only starting to understand now that there are these influences, unseen, grabbing our attention. And what's happening now is people are now aware of that. They're aware that they're sitting on Instagram or whatever, TikTok, with 2 billion closest friends, which is not natural in the first place.
Yeah.
And there's this wave of content coming at them, and they know they're being manipulated. And so for a younger generation, and maybe it is Gen Z, but I think maybe some of the younger millennials, they've started to realize that they have to rely on each other to navigate through this mass of information. So they're relying on friends to recommend things to them, and family and people just like them. So their whole idea of influence has changed from the old days of people like me. When I looked up to journalists, it was like a vertical trust, or news organizations. Now it's much more friends and family. And the second part, and this is where the intentional part comes in, is people more and more are looking for smaller communities that are based on their activities, their interests, to give them information that doesn't hijack their worst instincts, but gives them information that helps them live out their best intentions. So health, for example, or sports or activities. You know, we're starting to see Strava, the activity app, becoming a little social network. People already in gaming are going on Discord, which is a massive communication platform now. So that's what I mean by the change. From the age of intention, where your worst instinct was hijacked unknowingly by the platform, to now you're conscious. Oh, I know what's going on here. So I'm going to gravitate to smaller communities where I trust people that are safer, and they're giving me some piece of content that helps me be better on the basis of who I am, not what advertising profile someone fed into the algorithm. And so that idea of this intentional economy, intentional experiences, I think is the secret weapon for humanity right now. And I think it's going to change everything, not just marketing, but I also think leadership, entrepreneurship, and of course, politics.
Yeah, it's it's something that I think about a good bit, and again, I've talked about a little bit lately in talking about attention, is how the algorithm has affected things. And actually, I think most people, even if not millennials and Gen Z, even our generation, us older folk, have cottoned on to the fact that the algorithm is feeding the same out to you. So where you might have thought at one point the algorithm is giving you the stuff that you're really interested in and your little group of friends is interested into, and then you talk to somebody else who shows you the same thing that's just been put on their feed, but you're very different to that person. You're like,
Yeah.
hold on a second, what's going on here? I'm part of as you said, that the 2 million people who are getting the same message. So I think people are looking for those more real life experiences, looking for communities. As I tend to do, when you said it, I was like, that's really interesting. This idea of an attention economy. And it took me one way, which I found out was maybe not the way it has been written about before. So I'd like to maybe just chat about that for a little while. So what I took out of it was this idea that actually the power of purpose
Yeah.
is going to be really important,
Yeah.
and has obviously been important. I think it's certainly in the last decade in terms of, again, brands or people in power getting people's attention. This is what I am about. This is our purpose, and come with us. But actually doing a little bit of reading on it, there's a guy called Doc Searles. I don't know if you've come across him, who seemed to
attention
coin
economy,
the phrase.
He did.
And I thought what was fascinating about it was completely different to what I thought where you were going with the intention economy was. Because what he seems to be saying is actually, let's move it away from the sellers pushing out all this overload of information into the buyers being the ones to reverse and flip that script. And we talk about Eddie Bernays there, an old hero of mine from my college days. This idea that the customer is king has always been, one of these myths that has been put out into marketing, but never seems to be backed up at all. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, and is that somewhere you see the intention economy going, that we start to see? We were speaking just before this a little bit about travel agents and this idea that a buyer could come to someone and say, I want to do this and do these things when I go to visit Italy. What are my options?
So Doc Searles is the first person that puts this economic layer underneath what sounds like a very philosophical shift, right? So I worked for big technology platforms, or worked with them. I've worked directly for Twitter, which was all about the attention, grabbing you, and it wanted to serve the most outrageous content. And my job in Twitter was to try fight back against the business model of my own company. I wanted to give people the connection to people who really meant something to them on the basis of their identity. But of course, the business model ran totally counter. And this is the dirty secret of Silicon Valley. They promise us experiences that will make us live better lives as humans, and their business model is based on surveillance of our interests. So that was the old attention economy, and that's why the word economy is in there. In the intention economy, I worked for Spotify, and I never forget one day the chief technology officer said, listen, we started out with 2-minute pop songs. Then we went to like hour-long podcasts, and then we bought audiobooks, 12-hour experiences. The reason why we can do that is because our business model is building your loyalty. If every week I send you recommendations for music, same as Netflix, right? I need to get it right every week. So I need to understand you better. I need to go with you on your journey, not to grab your attention. So when you sit down in front of Netflix at night, or you get your Discover Weekly on Spotify, loyalty, intention is the only game in town. So that's why the intention economy is based on things like lifetime value. So if you're in the business world, you'll know what that means. Like I can get you for 2 seconds, serve an ad against your eyes. But if I've got you for years and I build up your loyalty, I understand you, not just what you're doing, but what you want to do, then we have a real shift because now that's a different economic model. Now the criteria are totally different. I want you to feel like I'm helping you be better at what you really care about, whether it's the place you live. So I'm giving you the right information about transport. Like you and me might live next door to each other, but right now the algorithm tells us the same local news. If you were at a bike to work and I get the dart, if you've got 3 kids and I'm single, we don't have the same local news. So that's where the intention economy is much more about serving us individually, what's best for us. So let's say it's our place. I want to know what the weather is because I'm cycling. I want to know what the traffic is because I'm driving. Starts to understand us better. Our profession. We want to go into work with the one idea on a Monday morning that nobody else has heard about. So we want to have some form of news service that over time learns. We're in the marketing business, and Monday mornings when we want a really thoughtful piece of content, we're going home at night. I want to know what's on Netflix. So I want entertainment at the end of a day. And so suddenly the algorithm is primed for a completely different outcome. It's your place, your profession, and your passion. So people are very different in their little foibles. And if an algorithm is primed for lifetime value, it will serve you a much more intentional experience to make you feel loyal to that experience over time. So it's 2 things. It's a big shift in the economy because people now are recognized for the people they really are and all their complexities. And secondly, then, it's a much more developed expectation for the consumer, and that's why Doc Searles is right. It moves away from the seller to the individual who's buying an experience that matches theirs in a much more conscious way. I mean, I feel when I use the Spotify algorithm, it understands me really well. And having worked for Spotify, I mean, that's a very complicated algorithm in the background.
Yeah.
And they've done so much work over the years to make sure they're not recommending you White Christmas in July.
And to your point, you can feel that. I love music. I DJ as a part of my side hustle. I've done it for 20 years. But I remember initially with Spotify, I was disappointed in it. Getting my Discover Weekly on a Monday going, yeah, you don't know me. Because it was giving me things. But you can feel over the last number of years how tight that date is getting. And now it's actually every week I'm like, whoa, here's another 5 songs.
And it's actually sounds. I associate now sounds with this. So the old attention economy was wow, WTF. The new intention economy is, never knew that. And so you can actually hear that. It's a very American podcast affirmation of like, never expected you to say that.
Yeah.
So serendipity, this idea that the song that you like. So the way it works basically is that you and me don't know each other, but you listen to track 1 on that album and I listen to track 6, and the algorithm is picking up the affinity and send it back to us. And hopefully the reaction is, that's very like that thing I like here. And so the consequences of it are amazing. Like people said that Spotify would end up demolishing local music because it would have one big monolithic hit parade. It's totally the opposite. All of the top 10 music in all of the big European markets now are all local language. 20 years ago, all English. So it's actually picked up these nuances, creates new cultural movements by taking the music of French-speaking Africa to Paris. In Paris, it gets mixed up, all the slang gets sent back to French-speaking Africa. And it's kind of like this incredible distillation, this acceleration of all those great cultural trends that may have taken years. The birth of hip hop happens because someone gets 2 turntables and a microphone, creates a whole new genre. And that's happening now all the time because the move to much more intentional experiences that ally to my personality, not to an advertising category in the algorithm.
As you say, it's a massive shift. And you can see there's definitely a journey already happening, I think, with the smart companies out there. So for example, again, 4 weeks ago when we were talking about attention economy as a group of marketeers, one of the myths was around the soundbite of it needs to be 2 seconds long. You're only going to have 2 seconds. You got to get them. But the reality is the shift is definitely now happening where if I am a musician or just interested in music, or like my nephew who's really got into running long distance lately, he's more than happy to sit down and listen to 6 hours
Right.
of content. It's got his attention. And again, it's the intention is feeding on those interests that he has to give him something new. I'm wondering, where Mark Little is now, you're currently advising a bunch of companies. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Are you seeing those kind of conversations happening at that top level then of how can organizations organize themselves around this potentially massive shift?
Yeah, so one of the things I get a lot is talking to bigger companies who in the old days would have employed a marketing company to come up with a campaign, to develop all the assets, to buy all the media time, and then have a big launch. And then that was it. And hopefully they would grab people's attention for the couple of seconds and they would get the soundbite in the news and they might do what, and now you realize that's the opposite way. So the companies that are really working well, and I'm talking about big old-fashioned, state bodies or big organizations that have a lot of, assets to put out there. What they're more and more doing is taking people in, a sample, for example, from the customer base that you want to engage with, bringing them in, talking to them at the beginning before they start launching the campaign, understanding that what we're looking for most of all is people like us, but smarter. So there's really interesting work being done on how you establish trust with a generation now that doesn't respect institutions anymore. One of the things I see about successful connections that are being made, let's say, a brand launches a big podcast and it wants people to sit down for an hour and it wants to know how they can get that kind of intentional experience. Well, some great research being done about that. What will make someone sit down and listen to another person? Well, for a younger generation, trust is based on affinity. This person's kind of like me, but smarter. They're transparent. So if I'm listening to them about finance or health, they're not going to sell me something against my interests. And finally, they're accountable. Like I can talk to them, not like me on the telly when I was a journalist, when everyone was passive. Nobody could talk back to me. In this relationship, the brand need to listen more in some ways than they talk. So there has to be some form of accountability for the brand to the audience. Now, once you start getting those experiences, that's when you get permission to sit down and say, hey, I grabbed your attention, but I want to sit with you for a moment and talk to you about this thing I'm doing. And I'm going to listen to you as well. And I never thought that. So that two-way street, and that is the basis of trust. I call that horizontal trust because it's coming from friends, family, people like me. It's the parasocial relationship that people form with their favorite podcaster or TikToker. And I think brands understanding that dynamic, suddenly, for many people that I talk to these days, whether they're a big brand or a small startup, it's kind of liberating. Just take my profession, journalism. In the old days, to be a journalist, I had to persuade someone to hire me. My trust was based on the byline or the title I had, and the audience never, ever could answer back to me. Today, as a journalist, if someone asked me out of journalism school, I'd say, you can create your own community, and your trust will be built up on your engagement. And what they're looking for you, for them, is transparency and accountability. So I'm advising a startup at the moment. I was at a conference last week where this person is setting up a foreign correspondent network, but direct community. So the app allows them to talk to a community, want to know information about Gaza or about Ukraine. And they have a direct relationship with that community rather than being part of an organization. So that's the kind of movement, and it is a movement that's happening right now. And it's incredible because, again, it puts the experience of the individual at the heart of the conversation. And then brands can actually form a much deeper long-term relationship than they could by having, a momentary campaign to grab attention on a product that was already fully formed before it reaches the consumer. So that's the kind of change from a vertical trust to horizontal.
Yeah, I think long-term is fascinating in that for me and what we do, it's something we talk a lot to our clients about. There was a brilliant conversation recently between Thomas Heatherwick, who's a designer in the UK. He's done the London Routemaster bus up to amazing architectural projects around the world. But he sat down and had a conversation with Niels Leonard, who's the founder of an ad agency called Uncommon. And Niels made this point that Thomas just disarmed him straight away because he asked one question, which was, how long did it take you to make that piece of work? How long did it last for?
Wow.
And Niels, as the ad man, was completely taken back. Whereas Thomas comes from a world of, it probably takes a long time to come up with it, but it's also hopefully going to last for hundreds of years,
right,
if he does it right. So I think there's a really, as you said, the powerful shift here is how do brands in particular, maybe in our world, try and navigate that big shift because they're so used to planning something and
Right.
then executing it. And as you say, not have a conversation or feedback loop come back to them.
Hmm.
Obviously now we're in a very different world where it is a two-way conversation. But I wonder if it might be a good segue into talking about one of the other things you said back at that festival a couple of weeks ago was about this idea, Reid Hoffman's idea of ABZ planning, which it wasn't a term I had heard
Hmm.
of until that day, but struck me as fascinating. And maybe this might be a nice way to talk into some of your history and the way you've trailblazed your way from media into technology, to talk about maybe Storyful first in terms of was that plan A, or how did that journey come along?
Yeah, and I think this takes me into an area where I realize that a lot of the kind of things we talk when we talk about innovation are just such bullshit. They're so separated from the real experience of the innovator. Like we talk about like entrepreneurs, like there's some high priest class, right? Benighted that we all woke up one day and we're Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, and we're the people who go out there and the famous Crazy Ones ad, which is the
Yeah.
famous Apple advertisement, which I think in 1987 it was, and that I think is responsible for all of the worst things we know about entrepreneurs. Like, yes, Picasso, and yes, those people were misfits and outlaws, right? But it makes it sound like, only people who are crazy
Good point.
can be really like good entrepreneurs. And it's exactly the opposite. I always feel it's a right kind of crazy. And that's about the idea of survival, is what we think about when we go into, I was a foreign correspondent, so I would go to war zones. My job in the morning, and I can remember having a very clear understanding of the fraction of a chance that I would die or be injured that day. My job was to get back to the hotel or the bar that night and tell a war story to my friends. Became a journalist. That was the world I lived in. Then became an entrepreneur, and I thought that's what being an entrepreneur was: survival, not sleeping. I used to tell people famously I would do 2 red eyes with Storyful, going from Los Angeles to New York and back to Dublin, and I would literally sleep on the plane. And I would be so proud of this because that meant I was really like hard charging, crazy one. I thought charisma was the thing that would unite my team. I thought, just speaking fearlessly. I remember the slogan when I was at Twitter. I had a sticker on my laptop that says, communicate fearlessly to build trust. It was all
The big sticker.
so much, a big sticker on my head. It was like, that was the way, the message, right? And I realized the exact opposite. So being a startup is creating something exceptional in a state of extreme uncertainty. So it's much more important than to think about how your brain can be trained to cope with uncertainty. And that led me to resilience, which is get up every day, going to get a kick in the head. It's just like yesterday. It's going to be really hard, but it's okay. I got this. I'll do it tomorrow because yesterday I did it. And resilience is being able to sort of see the long term, not being the crazy one. I think building trust with your team. It's not about telling them to work all the hours they can work. It's about the idea of devolving power to them. So it's not about management. It's about leadership, which is you walk in the room as a good manager and everyone knows you're in charge. As a good leader, you're ceding power to people. You're trusting them to essentially take decisions themselves, and you're building a long-term view of that. So it's not about your charisma anymore. It's about your consistency of leadership over time. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is against all the guidebooks they give you for entrepreneurship. And so as I realized the bullshit around entrepreneurship, I started to realize then the bullshit again around the way we think as companies, grab people's attention. No, stick with them for the long term. So it's been a real change for me over the years of realizing that the secret of great innovation is about building that trust. It's about resilience. And more, I think, in the age of artificial intelligence, it's about devolving human agency to individuals, making them feel more powerful. Not because you're some magician in the corner that can bewitch them, but because you're actually helping them live a better life, whether they're someone who works for you or they're someone you're trying to connect with. And I think that over time has been the big revelation. And I sometimes wonder how people get away with still promoting that Elon Musk idea that that's innovation. It's so dangerous. And I think it destroys a lot of companies. And I think it also destroys a level of trust sometimes when people are communicating. And obviously it creates a terrible form of politics where the people who can grab our attention and be extreme are the ones that get rewarded. So that's why for me, it's a common theme now. between.
It's often the way I think creativity is spoken about too, isn't it? This idea that it's up there and only a certain few have it.
Yeah.
Whereas again, the current thinking seems to be along the lines of actually it's a muscle like anything else, and everybody has it. You either exercise it or you don't, but you can learn on it.
Well, even with AI now, there's a whole thing about large language models will like replace humans, and in the creative industries, I know there's a lot of worries about that. One of the things about creativity I find really interesting now is that people assume the machine's going to take over because they will just create all these experiences that we can't compete with, and I think it's the exact opposite. Like all of us train our own models. Like the Beatles were the model for ABBA. They talk about sitting, listening to the White Album again and again and again. And I think everybody who feels their creativity is going to be replaced, I think there will be such an insatiable demand for the slight foible indifference of the human created content compared to the commoditized version the AI will produce, that I think we'll see the essence of human creativity that is in all of us. So this idea that it's only crazy people that can be creative is so anti-human. And I think that's what's led us down these like really bad habits as individuals to feel we can't do it. What I love at the moment is my kids, like in the old days when I was young, Hit Parade, Thursday night, Pop of the Pops, Hot Press, whatever, smash hits. And that would be the week. Everyone would talk about that piece of music and that was it. Today, my kids live in this cloud of creativity. My son came to me recently and said, Dad, you ever hear the Steely Dan? It's like, he's man at the Smiths and the Jam. Yeah, come here. But like for him, creativity is this cloud around him that he's discovering all at once. And I look at his experience and I envy that rather than having to sit down and television telling me what was creative that week, what was on mark or in trend. So I think right now we are going to an age when by having AI taking the commodity, it's leaving us to understand what's truly human. And that would be my wish for this generation, is that they be a lot more liberated about how they define creativity.
Yeah, it's something I'm envious of, to use your words too, of just how, millennials and Gen Z will be in that cloud, for example. Like, again, something I've been talking about lately has been that idea of the old subcultures of if you were into hip hop,
yeah,
you were the hip hop kid.
Yeah.
But you definitely didn't listen to Beyonce or the pop music that's over there. But now it's, as you said, it's a swirl of I've listened to Steely Dan, that's led me to ABBA. Now I'm listening to Justice from France, and the swirl of just sparks that are...
If you go back to like the Beatles, right? The Beatles were the Cunard liners would come in from the south of America with skiffle and R&B and blues, and they would land at Liverpool. It was no coincidence the Beatles came from Liverpool because the sailors would get off with the records, sell it into the record store, owned by a guy who became the manager of John, Paul, George and Ringo, and they got the free records. So essentially that was how we got the Beatles became pop, and then pop leads into something else. We've always had these moments of connection, but now they're more evident. And now we can see they're not magic. They weren't crazy people. These are people that were literally just opening up like a sponge to experiences around them, and that made them more human. So it's almost like the end of The Wizard of Oz, when we realize a lot of the things that pass for creativity and trust were actually just all manufactured by someone behind a curtain.
Yeah.
And now we can all realize that we actually have that power. So that's, I think, for me, again, back to this ABZ idea that we have about when you get in a business or you're doing some risky creative act, having a plan A where you want to go, but also knowing that the future is not a binary choice, right and wrong. It's a combination of different things that happen to you. So you might produce a product and that's your intention, but your customers might use it a completely different way. And you're like, oh, well, actually, that's where I'm going now. So it's plan B. And then it all goes to shit. And you don't, how am I going to survive? Well, you get in the lifeboat, which is plan Z, have enough money to work out, is there another way of going about this to get a new plan A? And so that's a Reid Hoffman, as you say, former LinkedIn founder. I think it's a great way to run a business, but also if you're in the creative arts or in the creative businesses, when you create a piece of art, people use it very differently than the way you intend it. You create a marketing campaign, people use it in a very different way. You have a piece of a lyric in a song and people interpret it differently. So being open to that idea that the future is never a binary choice, it's a combination.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because agility is such a word internally in organizations, a lot about how that now we have to be more agile, maybe be open to this, but maybe from an outward and facing brand communications point of view, there isn't enough of that at the moment of understanding, well, we've put this message out, but look what the response is, look what's coming back to us, and maybe let's go this way with this. Rather than the very preordained, this is our campaign and let's live with this for 3 or 5 years. How can we be more real and more quick and
Right.
speed? Right.
I think the first time I remember virality became the big thing back maybe the 2010s. And my business, Storyful, was finding viral videos for use by advertisers. So advertisers would find some theme they want to be associated with, happiness or whatever it would be. And we'd give them all these viral videos. And they'd plan viral campaigns. And it was always like someone trying to throw themselves a surprise birthday party, like trying to find the magic of what was virality. And you know what? It was like the only way they could work would be to just take the risk of throwing something out. And people might interpret it completely differently. And once you have the feedback loop with the individuals, that's why having them in before you launch and realizing that actually this focus group didn't react the way we thought they would. But you know something? They reacted to this part of our message. That is the beauty of the agility you talk about, putting yourself at the mercy of the people that you want to engage rather than coming out with a fully formed product where you might just like push it on the people through a massive advertising campaign. It might have some impact, but never really develop the kind of loyalty you want. So trial and error and having, as you say, like people talk about, failing better. So this is a great quote from Sam Beckett that people will know. I've seen it now tattooed on people's arms and on fridge magnets, which is ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Beckett wasn't saying, self-optimize, this is the secret of success. If you just fail enough, you'll be successful. He wasn't saying that. He said, you will fail. That's it. It's futile to avoid it. And once you accept the futility of your life, because you'll fail and get it wrong, that's actually liberating. And so for me, coming to terms with my inevitable failure has been the secret of my success as an entrepreneur. And I really advise people not to get into this self-optimizing, the kind of agile can go too far. Sometimes you just have to risk falling in your face.
What seems important is the idea of the speed of how you do react, or maybe move to the B or the Z in that plan. And one of the other things, again, to keep going back to the Innovators Festival that you said that day, but it's definitely a kind of a golden thread through our conversation so far is around trust. Right. And one of the things you'd said was everything moves at the speed of trust, which to your point today was a moment, not something I'd overly considered too much before, but it makes total sense in terms of certainly the work that we do or I've done personally. But the best work is always built on trust, and things move quickly if trust exists, but it doesn't. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think for communicators, they'll probably know this better because there is actually within the public relations theory this concept of benevolence. That if you're somebody who has the back of the person you're talking to, if someone knows that you've got my back, that's trust. So, in a group of friends, right, there might be 6 people, and one of them is an expert in movies, one's an expert in music, one's an expert in tech, right? And you trust them because over time they know you. You won't ask the wrong person for the wrong advice and the wrong thing, but you'll know a certain person has your back, knows your interests, who you are. The risk of betraying their trust is huge because it's a friend group. You don't want to be the person that just off the top of their head recommends something that will erode trust. So that idea of knowing that you have someone's back and they have your back is so hard to gain. And it's also very easy to lose if you're cavalier with it. And so I think in the example of a company, it's a small startup, there's 12 people, and they're looking to you not to get up every morning and give them an inspirational speech and be charismatic and work harder than everyone else. They want you for the long haul to know that you're going to trust them to take a decision. And so once that happens and you devolve power, the company moves quicker because now everybody knows what they're in charge of. So a good example I'll give is when I was at Twitter, and Twitter was going through a terrible time. The day I joined, I think the stock price had fallen 10%, not because of me, but it just happened.
Yeah.
And I had to get up and give a speech, and I gave the old speech, but I'm so excited about the challenge ahead. And someone took me aside and said, don't ever make that speech again. No one's going to trust you if every week you're getting up telling you how excited they are at the challenge. So I worked internally at Twitter. They had a learning development team. They helped me craft an authentic message, which was I had 3 questions. Every time it was a tough week. Number 1, do you agree with the vision of the company? At least have a clear idea what it is. Number two, is there someone on your team you can trust to talk to? And number three, do you have a hand on a lever that's going to move the business forward? And if your answer to 2 out of 3 questions is yes, stay with it, and we'll work in the third. If you can answer no to all 3 questions, then it's time to leave, for your sake as much as anyone's. And that's a really authentic way of connecting, and that's about trust. Because over time, if it's one of us breaks that contract, we know it. So I think that idea that once everyone's got their hand on the lever, things move really quickly, and you no longer, as the leader, have to soak up the anxiety of everyone around you, because that'll kill you. It did almost me twice. So yeah, I think for me, trust is not just some thing that you buy or you acquire. It has to be nourished and maintained, and it's so easy to lose.
And maybe to your point, we need to be more intentional about getting people's trust. Again, in brand world, there's common metrics that are talked about for lots of campaigns and communications that go out. So what was our reach? How was our engagement? You mentioned affinity earlier.
Yeah.
You don't hear trust, like, in a way that's kind of connected to affinity, but trust is not something that comes up in conversations a lot.
Interesting.
And it's what's fascinating about this conversation is it feels like it should be talked about. Especially in a world where it is a two-way conversation now, rather than this monologue of brands seeking to get your attention.
Well, you said the word monologue. It's interesting to say that, because I think, like, I spent a lot of my life pitching, like literally everything. I would literally walk into rooms with my family and I'd feel like I'm pitching them or something, because that's the way my brain was wired. I need money from you. You're a big investor, a customer, and so I'm going to pitch you all. I walked around. I might have walked into the supermarket sometimes. I want to pitch the person selling me. I was like, oh, this is terrible. And so over time, I realized the power of listening. That's the secret power, when you're actually have the bravery to listen. I'll give you an example. I was a TV correspondent. I was put in a studio interviewing a politician. It was Michael McDowell. People might remember. And at the end of a question, he said, "Oh, Bertie Ahern is a socialist." He said something so outrageous, but I wasn't listening because I was thinking about my next question, and I missed it. And a producer came up after and said, "Have the bravery to listen, not be thinking about your next question, your next pitch. Sit with the conversation, and maybe have a little bit of a pause." And over time, obviously now there's more books written about how to listen properly as your great form of communication strengths than it is about pitching. And I think this shift is part of the intentional shift again. It's like, sit with you and just let the pause sit. And that person now knows I've actually heard them. And that's where trust comes from. You're actually listening to me. You're not trying to take the money in your own pocket or convince the startup employee that the company's not going out of business, And so listening to people, understanding what they really feel as opposed to what demographic they're part of. I think that's the central key part of trust. And it doesn't come easy to executives.
Yeah, it's a very human thing, isn't it? Like, we're talking about AI a little bit there and the technologies that's bringing in. You were starting to talk about how that is a creative tool, but you still need the human bit. And the pause is fascinating. Like, one of the most interesting things I heard in Austin on South by Southwest was around the idea of, it's a brilliant creative tool. You can get AI, ChatGPT, or any of the models to give you a movie script right now, but it has no idea where to put the dramatic pause into that script, which I thought was a fascinating thought.
Yeah.
And a really good example of actually, back to the ABBA example and listening to the Beatles, we can have all these models, but it's what we do as our individuals or collectives in terms of how we can add, I think, a bit of the magic.
It's funny you say about AI, because it's helping me be a better listener, and I think back to Beckett. I remember going to this conference in Los Angeles, and again, I had my fail better idea, Beckett. Someone said, Beckett loved the silences, because he'd go for a walk with his dad on the Wicklow Mountains, and he would remember the iambic pentameter of his father walking, and it was the silence between the footsteps. And he never lost that. He wrote with that in mind. I love music for that reason. And I took that away, and I remember thinking about that a lot. And then AI came along, and I thought, well, it'll deliver me a great, research tool. So I'm using Notebook LM recently, which is a new Google product. And it does this podcast. It generates a podcast from whatever you put in.
I've heard that, yeah. I haven't used it.
I'm writing a book
yet.
at the moment.
Yeah.
I put a chapter in. Mistakenly, I also put some source material into the same notebook. So the podcast came back and said, this is a really interesting explanation of something, but there is a contradiction in this. I'm like, there's no fucking contradiction in this. And then I realized, no, it picked up a contradiction between what I had read in something and the actual meaning. So it's actually telling me, take a pause. You've mistaken something here. And now I use it a lot for checking out my own thinking, giving the machine what I'm thinking and telling me why it's wrong. And so there's like, that's one of the things about artificial intelligence for me. It's actually using it for the purpose people don't think it's there for, but to check yourself. When you start talking and you're probably parroting someone else's line, or you're repeating something unconsciously that you read in the paper that day, AI can be quite good at exposing the flaw, exposing the reason why that's wrong. So
there's something powerful in the idea of contradictory thoughts. The idea that you can be a better innovator, a better creative, a better entrepreneur, possibly from this idea of holding contradictory thoughts in your own mind. I think you mentioned this very lightly maybe in the talk a couple of weeks ago, but it'd be nice to pick your brain on how you think the power of that actually maybe in the book's case is making you write a better book.
Yeah, and I think that's in psychology, they talk about this as cognitive dissonance, when you have to hold two contradictory ideas in your head without going mad. And it's back to the ABZ, it's when you work on the basis that this is my success and this is how I define it, how I'll get there. But there's another pathway, and you don't know which one was right or wrong. Jeff Bezos, I'm not necessarily a huge admirer of his, but he has a great concept of the two-way door or the one-way door. Some doors, you just got to take a risk and go through, and you're not going to be able to come back. So if you say you're pitching to an investor, you can't really unpitch the investor. But there are other doors where you can go in, try it, look what's on the other side, and come back in again. And that's where I think is the great ability for AI to expose your contradictions, sit with them, be okay with them, and know that you don't know at any moment in time what the future holds. Stop trying to predict. Stop trying to have a set outcome. Because I think for me, that has been the secret over years now, particularly in this world. So for me, one of the biggest movements, and I think marketers don't realize this yet, is that we still think in a kind of a text, speech, video world, that they're just constructs. We're having a conversation. The conversation we're having is happening simultaneously in different realms of it all. And so as a result of that, conversation now is what really, for me, is the powerful part of communications. It's the give and take. Forget the modality or format. So I think a lot about, when I grew up learning Paddy Kavanagh's poetry, and he has this great poem about, being the king of every blooming thing, sitting in a laneway. There's a dance in Billy Brennan's barn. And I wished was AI could have imagined him sitting on that wall, talking to me, giving me that poem. And that's the example that I give, where this new technology is allowing us to transcend the limitations of speech and text and video and literally communicate on the basis of uncertainty and listening. So that's what I think AI is doing. I mean, it sounds very philosophical, but let's ground it in this basic reality. We do not know the future. And as soon as we agree with each other that the future's unknowable,
it will change.
That's liberating, because now everything's possible. And one of the things I keep saying to people at the moment is that the future's moving faster than ever before. It's out of control. More change will happen in the next 5 years than the last 5,000. And that's scary for everybody. But the one thing they should realize is when you're moving fast, tiny things can make huge differences. And that's why I think this idea of sitting with the uncertainty, listening better, communicating better, and having trust, that's the secret power in an age of accelerated change. Because if you make a decision right now, it can quickly be corrected and you can learn from it quickly, but only if you're open to that, as opposed to, doing a PR campaign that just lands and that's it, or writing a book.
Is there an element of, in writing the book, where you are trial and error yourself, I guess, in some of the conversations you're having?
Yeah.
So rather than sitting in the room or however you're writing and attacking that actually you're socializing and trial and error in some of the thoughts that maybe are coming in.
Yeah. And I'm exposing things that I just know are wrong. And then I have to go back and look at it again. And I'm writing about 1968, which for me is the birth of my birthday, 68. But it's when everything happens in technology. And I'm writing yesterday about that, and it's falling flat. And I know it is. I'm not communicating because I'm thinking too much about making this a neat chapter. And then suddenly I go on this rabbit hole about Bill Gates. He sets up his computer club in 1968, and he's from an elite school in Seattle. And before I know it, I'm down this rabbit hole for 2 hours learning about Bill Gates because of the failure to communicate my own feeling. And it was wonderful. I came out of a completely different understanding of him and his role in technology. And that for me is the beauty of writing a book, is sometimes when you start writing, you don't know where you're going. And for me, that's kind of a great analogy.
And isn't it a wonderful world, like you say, that we live in now, that can be a two-way conversation, that actually rather than just writing it, publish it and putting it out there in the world, that you're kind of doing that as you go, probably a lot of the time. There's an NYU professor, very successful podcaster, Scott Galloway.
Yes.
Who, I remember him talking about writing one of his books and how he's using ChatGPT in particular he would feed in this is my chapter, now argue against me.
Right.
To try and have that balance of, okay, I know how people are going to respond, what's going to be their contradictions or their opposing thoughts to mine, and then build that back into the argument.
Well, that's one of the things I think about when people talk about, they want to do they do something and they have a post-mortem. And what went wrong with what we just did? I think the opposite. It's almost like a pre-mortem. So this is one of the things I learned in startup land. It's great if you sit down and say, we're going to launch a new product or a campaign or whatever, and we will generally wait until we've launched it to see what went wrong. But what if you sat down and said, why will this go wrong? Not how, but why? What will screw this up? So we did that in my last startup, and it was so effective. It actually saved us at the end because we had a little flaw in the way we were collecting data, and we fixed it quickly. But if we hadn't had a pre-mortem, we would have ended up in this case with disaster in this particular case. So such were the risks. So for me, sitting down and doing what I call a steel man case of why I'm wrong, like take the most rigorous analysis of why what I do is wrong, listen to somebody telling me that, and then, work out what the consequences might be. And I think that's one of the very practical tips that I would advise people who are entering into this kind of iterative learning. Is just sit down to begin with and say, why will this fail? And, once you realize that, you don't have any fear anymore because you've actually sat with the worst case scenario and it's okay. And if you still progress, you're almost inoculated from fear because you've worked it out. And now you'll say, well, okay, it will fail if I don't do this. Well, make that right from the beginning and suddenly you increase your chances of success. So it's the great irony of creativity, right? I mean, I want to maximize my chance to end up in a different place than when I started, but I want to minimize the damage that might do to my brand or my company in the process. So it's always a kind of a give and a take. You have to be somewhere. And the great quote I always go back to is David Bowie. He has this great quote about creativity. He said, just when you're out on the water and you're out of your depth, at that very moment is the place you need to be all the time. And I think it's a great combination of the risk, out of your depth, but not so far that you're going to drown. And that navigation, I think, is probably for me the secret of creativity in an exponential and accelerated age where AI will come in and quickly spot the problem, but also quickly spread the great idea. And that's why, I can't think of a better time to be alive. Scary as hell, but again, resilience, just building your ability to fail quickly. I think you mentioned that earlier on. It's speed. That's really
brilliant. There's some brilliant tips, I think, in there for all of us. Coming back to one thing you said earlier, and even there in terms of not wanting to drown and stay alive. You mentioned earlier there might have been days that you woke up thinking, I'm not sure if I'm coming back today.
Yeah.
There
amazing.
Yeah.
All the time.
A different time. Was there one that really stands out in particular? Those
days? Yeah. I was about 10 minutes into the Storyful. I'd left RTE, big job. My wife, we sat down obviously before that happened and we worked it all out. And then after about a year, it was Christmas Eve, and there was an offer of investment that was the wrong offer. And I said no on Christmas Eve morning, got into the car with my wife to drive down to Galway. It was unseasonably snowy. I never forget navigating out of Dublin. All I cared about was getting out safely. But somewhere in Ballinasloe, like as Chris Rea is singing Driving Over Christmas for the 15th time on the radio, I got the guts up to say to my wife, I'm sorry, I think I failed. And there was a pause of maybe half a second. And she said, that's okay. You'll get a job. Don't worry about it. And I've never felt so elated in my life. And I drove the rest of the way to my family home in Connemara. Got there was an email from one of the investors saying, I'm not taking no for an answer. And the business was back up again. But the point was, at that moment when I'd confronted my worst fear, which was failure, complete failure. I really believe that at the moment. I never felt that fear again. Not as bad anyway.
Yeah.
So that was one of those moments. That sounds like a humble brag. There were other times that I fucked up badly. Like I didn't work out the difference between revenue and cash. You got revenue notionally, you're being paid like 20 grand a month, but you're not getting paid for 90 days.
Yeah.
The cash is not in the bank. And that led me to a moment where I had checks that were still being written on paper in my pocket addressing the team, not knowing whether I could cash them the next day. And then having to let people go. Like literally, they were no longer part of the company. People I've been friends with for years. And it killed me. That was awful. And I still like get a shiver when I think about that. But, you know, that moment of responsibility for your own actions and realizing it's not academic. That's the less of the humble brag one. But at the same time, the company survived and went on, in the case of this company, Storyful, to be the best talent academy in journalism Ireland's ever had. Like it just, the people have gone on from there. So yeah, there's the worst case scenario. It's not just a nice story.
And sometimes I think again it comes back to the pause. Maybe it's the power of maybe a pause. So that pause in the car that day with your wife got you back maybe on track. We're on the back of a weekend when Rory McIlroy has achieved the Grand Slam, but this brilliant story has emerged of him talking to Harry in the golf buggy. I don't know if you've heard it.
I didn't hear that.
He's shifting from finishing the round back to the 18th tee for the start of the playoff. And Harry, who's a long lifetime friend of Rory's, who's his caddy, turns to him and goes, "We would have taken this on Monday." And he said, Rory said that instantly just changed his, "I've just missed a putt to win this thing."
Yeah.
To right up.
Yeah.
Let's go again.
Well, Ian Robertson, the psychologist, has a great book about this. He actually uses the caddy example as that voice in your head. And I think a lot about that because I think people have gone through any kind of mental health crisis or challenge. A lot of what they tell you about is have a sympathetic voice in your head. Because we're all basically a battle between the confident, like the computer brain in the front of our head and the amygdala, which is the lizard brain at the back. And your whole life is a dialogue between the two. And the
left brain and the right brain.
And the left brain and the right brain. Exactly, right? And people who are creative are not good at operations and stuff like that. So the world is just that dialogue in your brain. And I think over time you start to recognize those voices. So it's for me, one of the great psychologists I read is Martin Seligman, who talks about positive psychology. And the one thing that happens a lot, I think, is learned helplessness. You know, things happen again and again, and then you start tripping into your own personal failures and you know, how you break out of that, particularly in high-performance athletes. The other person who inspired me was Michael Phelps, the swimmer, who had real mental health issues. So what he did was he just developed every possible outcome was a video cassette in his brain, when there was video cassettes. He just placed it in, and one of the cassettes was, what if my goggles filled with water at a critical moment? And it happens. And he just puts the video in and said, well, this is how I react to that. So again, pre-mortem is one of those great moments where you can't ever have a learned helplessness again. And that's the secret of the resilience, you know. So the way I always compare it is I'm a sea swimmer, you know, I tell you about that. That's how you know I'm a sea swimmer. But I remember going in the first winter and it was so cold and it was still cold tomorrow and the next day, but your body gets used to it.
That's exactly
Suddenly you're just acclimatized. So yeah, there's all the different, you know, psychologists you can look at. But I love that Rory McIlroy moment of you did this before, you got it. And those words, we've got this. I've had to say them many times in group settings. And the power of that is incredible.
Phelps has a great example too. I think I can't remember which one of the gazillion medals it was he won, but he had an interview post winning the gold medal. And the interviewer asked him, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And he said, "I'm getting up at 5 o'clock and I'm going to go put more money in the bank." That's what I do. And by money in the bank, he meant getting in the pool.
Yeah.
This is what I do. This hasn't changed anything and we're going to go again. You know, resilience, it's unbelievable.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
One of those things that I do advise, like people talk about getting an exit, you know, a lot of people say, well, you have a business or something, you want to live in an island and have like Burgundy on tap, you know, like what's your outcome? And most people will tell you, oh, I want to take a time off after my next startup, and they can't, and they get very unhappy. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs who run a race like a marathon and then stop, and they don't get up the next day at 5 a.m., put money in the bank, and they're lost. So I do think there's a lot of that goes around, and in innovation is there's almost a feeling that once you survive it all, everything that's going to work out at the end. And people don't think about the entrance to the next stage of your life. They only think about the exit from this stage. And I think that's where we do need to support a lot of people who are very creative but find themselves without that ability to do what Phelps said in that circumstance.
It's been a great conversation. I feel like we could keep chatting for a long, long time. We might end up at where we started, maybe, as a last kind of question in terms of, again, back to people's attention. You are deeply involved in technology at the moment and have been for a long time. Is there something in particular, one thing that maybe stands out to you in terms of a trend that you're seeing that we aren't giving enough attention to?
That's a great point. I do think it's about consciousness. I think I'm looking at American politics right now, and I'm looking at very negative things. We've been very positive in our conversation, and there's a very, very negative part to the shift in history we're in at the moment, where essentially politics is like sport now in the United States, and there's a culture of spectacle. And if you continually sort of hammer home the same message again and again and keep grabbing people's attention, doing horrific things, being cruel, you grab people's attention. And I don't think we've actually overcome that part yet. And I think for me, it's a great problem at the moment is we're all thinking about regulation and what political changes we should have and economic changes. But fundamentally, it's about a new mindset. We are living in an age like no other in human history. We're just not built for this. And so, we have to wake up to the fact that we live in a 19th century democracy. We're living with 22nd century technology, and our brains are back in the cave. And it's our brains we need to work on. And for me, that's the missing part of the conversation at the moment, is just raising consciousness that it's not normal, this time we live in. And so you have to work in your own mindset. And I think too many people are just thinking there's some political solution or some regulation that will change the platforms. It's not. I think each one of us have to, ourselves, first of all, put on the oxygen mask, raise our consciousness. In the jobs we do, help, proselytize the things we've talked about. And finally, with our children, not just teach them, but learn from them. Because my kids are much better able to deal with this than I am. And I find whenever I start talking to them about dangers they might face online, they're like, nah, Dad, we got that. I think I'm worried about you.
Yeah.
So I think, most important thing is start learning from the generation that's coming up, because they've been born into this reality, and they're so much more able to deal with all the cognitive dissonance we've talked about. So that's, for me, the biggest issue, is pay more attention to our mindset, and everything else will lead from that.
Magic. Well, look, again, Mark, thank you for your time today.
Oh, my
really
pleasure.
Looking forward to the book.
Yeah, thank you.
When's that coming out,
They always tell you don't ever talk about writing a book because you'll never finish it. So at the moment, I'm just trying to get it done. Brilliant. And then kind of open up. It's just about finding voice, and that's part of what the book writing is.
Well, I can't wait.
The theme we've just been talking about. So thanks for this. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Mark. Cheers.